A US administration attempting to topple Cuba's communist government is not new news, nor is an American embargo of the island. However, the Cuban regime is under more pressure and is more vulnerable than at any point since the 1990s, and perhaps since its foundation in 1959. Donald Trump's total oil blockade means that Cuba's fuel supply is drying up fast, exacerbating chronic blackouts, shortages of food and medicine, disrupting daily life, and accelerating the island's downward spiral. So in this video, we're going to explain what's going on in Cuba, what Trump wants, and whether the government can survive. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. Cuba went through a severe economic crisis in the 1990s, known as the Special Period, following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Soviet Union had been Cuba's primary benefactor and trade partner, helping the Cuban economy survive after the United States imposed a total embargo on trade and commerce with Cuba back in 1962, shortly after the 1959 Cuban Revolution brought Fidel Castro to power. Fortunately for Cuba's communist regime, the end of the 1990s also brought the end of the precarious Special Period, as in 1999, a new ideological ally had emerged in Latin America in the form of Venezuela's socialist president Hugo Chavez. In 2000, Castro and Chavez signed a landmark agreement that would see Chavez send Cuba heavily discounted Venezuelan oil, while Castro would send tens of thousands of Cuba's well-regarded professionals in the healthcare, education, science and technology fields to Venezuela, and later intelligence and security officials to help shore up Chavez's government. In the mid-2010s, however, the global oil glut sent oil prices sharply downwards, contributing to a socio-economic crisis in Venezuela. As such, Venezuela, under Chavez's hand-picked successor Nicolás Maduro, reduced the volume of oil it was shipping to Cuba. Fortunately for Cuba, though, by then led by Fidel Castro's brother Raúl, its relationship with the United States was actually improving, thanks to Obama's so-called Cuban thaw. Between 2014 and 2016, diplomatic relations were restored. The US removed Cuba from its list of state sponsors of terrorism, Obama made a historic visit to Cuba, and certain travel and trade restrictions were lifted, although the embargo remained in place as it can only be ended by the US Congress. But this mild respite from US pressure was not to last. Donald Trump took a hard line on Cuba, reinstating the restrictions that Obama had relaxed, and redesignating the country as a sponsor of terrorism. While some of Trump's measures were lifted under Joe Biden, they were soon reimposed upon Trump's return in 2025. This was bad news for Cuba, which had already been in crisis since 2020. The COVID pandemic and collapse of international tourism contributed to Cuba's worst economic crisis in decades, from which it has struggled to recover. Economic and social conditions worsened, with power outages, spiking inflation, and shortages of food and medicine sparking a further exodus of Cubans out of the country, as well as social unrest, which was suppressed by the Cuban government, then led by President Miguel Díaz-Canel. Skip ahead to 2026 and things keep getting worse. Venezuelan oil shipments had already fallen in the past few years, but since US forces abducted Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro in early January and killed 32 Cuban soldiers in his security service in the process, Cuba has been totally cut off from Venezuelan oil. Other sources are being cut off too. In late January, Trump threatened to impose tariffs on any country selling oil to Cuba. Crucially, this has prompted Mexico, which was actually Cuba's largest supplier of oil in 2025, to halt shipments to Cuba, something that Mexico's leftist president Claudia Sheinbaum has lamented, but that seems unlikely to reverse given her country's delicate trade negotiations with the US. According to Kepler Limited, January 2026 was Cuba's first month in a decade with zero oil imports, and fuel supplies are drying up fast. Amid a shortage of aviation fuel, several airlines, including from Canada, which is Cuba's top source of tourists, have suspended flights to Cuba. Bad news given that it's peak tourist season and much of Cuba's economy relies on tourism, which is a crucial source of foreign currency. So the crisis in Cuba is only getting worse. Fuel shortages means more blackouts, more food and medicine shortages, and the grinding down of daily life, as President Díaz-Canel has announced fuel rationing in a bid to protect essential services. These are not unfortunate side effects, but rather grinding the country to a halt is the point of Trump's oil blockade. But what exactly is his endgame? Trump has been urging the Cuban government to, quote, make a deal before it is too late. But exactly what he wants from a deal is unclear. In the case of Venezuela, Trump made clear he wanted US access to Venezuela's oil and appears to be happy to leave the regime broadly in place, but with a more pliable leader than Maduro. Could a similar setup satisfy Trump in Cuba? Perhaps. But then again, Cuba isn't sitting on vast oil reserves like Venezuela, so maybe some other form of mild opening up to foreign interests, cooperation on migration and drug trafficking, and a release of prisoners. Well, according to Cuba's deputy foreign minister, there have been exchanges of messages between the Cuban and American governments, but not yet proper dialogue, with Cuba insisting that political and economic change is not on the table. But Trump may in fact be pushing for full regime change, something that his Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who was born to Cuban immigrant parents, has long desired, as have many others in the Cuban diaspora, who are a notable voting bloc of the Republican Party. If regime change is indeed the goal, despite Trump being buoyed by his Venezuelan operation, the US may naturally be wary of getting caught up in any military action in Cuba, not least because of the long shadow of the disastrous failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. Marco Rubio's words could be instructive. He said, "We would love to see regime change, but that doesn't mean that we're going to make a change." One might infer from the administration's words and actions that it hopes to indirectly inspire change by blockading the country and pushing it to breaking point, thereby inspiring the people to rise up and topple the government, or at least cause enough trouble to force it to back down and agree on some kind of transition. This would be a plan that comes with significant risks and no guarantee of success. After all, Cuba's communist government has survived existential threats and defied predictions of its collapse several times, while weathering a more than 60-year embargo. Decades of government consolidation means that Cuba does not have democracy in its recent memory, nor is there an established opposition movement or obvious democratic leadership waiting in the wings. So fueling a humanitarian crisis on the island may just prompt further governmental repression, and any kind of extended crisis, or state collapse, could spark a greater exodus of Cuban emigres, which is surely not Trump's desired outcome. As is so often the case these days, a lot of how this plays out depends on influence, not only who technically has the power to make things happen, but also who has the sway to make sure that it does. That's why last year we put together a list of the world's 25 most influential people, using rankings from you, our audience, as well as from our journalists. This year we've done the same, producing a brand new ranking for 2026. In the upcoming issue of our magazine Too Long, we explore our list telling the stories of a number of people who made the list, from the return of Donald Trump and the calculated moves of Xi Jinping to the AI frontiers of Sam Altman. We also look at the new entries, New York's first Muslim mayor Zohran Mamdani, the radical shift of Pope Leo XIV, and the bastion of technocracy Prime Minister Mark Carney, as well as the shadows that still linger, like Jeffrey Epstein. As always, this issue of Too Long features a whole lot more than just our most influential people ranking though. We also have a whole featured segment on how the UK became more divided than ever and how a broken country could rebuild, the fragmentation emerging within the EU, how religion is being used by politicians around the world, and much, much more. You can pre-order your copy at toolong.news, or to get the best deal, you can just subscribe to the magazine. Doing so gets you 20% off every copy for the lifetime of your subscription, and if you use the code SPRING26, you'll get an additional £3 off your first copy, bringing the price down as low as £4.99. Find out more and order your copy today at toolong.news.